are coming in. All right. Oh. All right. Good morning, everybody. Happy Lag BaOmer, and welcome to the My Jewish Learning Daf Yomi Week in Review. I am Rachel Scheinerman, and this week we are. Hang on, let me make sure everyone's muted.
I got it.
Thank you. And we are delighted to be joined by Rabbanit Dasi Fruchter to whiz us through the last 7 dapim.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I haven't been with you in a little while, and it's so nice to see you all still here during Masachet Yevamos. This has been tricky. I see some of your faces like deep breaths, exhales. It's been Laura, especially, right? It's been a rough road through Yevamos so far for a few reasons. I think largely the daf can be incredibly difficult and complicated. And then on the other side, it's not always so relevant to our lives. So the pairing of those two things makes this tractate pretty difficult. But we are actually in the midst of an interesting week, I think, in some ways. In other ways, your eyes might have glazed over in the last couple of days. So let's actually begin with Daf 67. We're going to go through some highlights that came up on the Daf as we go through just each page. So what's really interesting is we're squarely in a discussion about who a Kohen, a priest, is allowed to marry. And if they do marry someone who is not permitted to them, what is the status of that person when it comes to eating truma, eating this, sanctified food that only the Kohanim are permitted to eat? So we really get into a discussion of, are they married or not, right? For the purposes of this. So that's one discussion we get into. A related discussion is, let's say a non-Kohanic woman marries a Kohen guy. Now, if she has children through him, then she is entitled to eat truma. If she does not, she is not. Now, what happens if she's pregnant with his child, right? And then he dies. Is she considered now a Kohanic woman because she has offspring through him? Or is she not pregnant, quote, enough? And on the flip side, if she's a Kohanic woman, she grew up in a Kohen family eating truma sandwiches for lunch every day, and then she marries a non-Kohen man. If her husband dies when she is pregnant, is she considered to still belong to her father's house, right? Going back to her father's house, or is she considered to be a Yisrael, a non-Kohen man right now? So with a non-Kohen man right now. So that's a really interesting discussion about the consequences of marrying between classes, right? Of the different Israelites, right? You have Kohen, Levi, Israel, and we really get into distinctions between them. And of course, these are legalistic discussions, but if you just close your eyes and think about it with me, what do you think planning a wedding must have been like between a non-Kohen woman and a Kohen, or vice versa, right? If she grew up in a Kohanic family, what do you think it was like for her to marry into a non-Kohanic family? Sounds a little bit like there's a penalty, right? And she is no longer able to eat truma. So that's really interesting. Oh no, are you losing me? Did you lose me? How am I, Rachel?
Just for a sec, but you're back.
Amazing. Not sure what happened. It's rainy over here, so maybe the rain is getting in the way of, I don't know, maybe a Kohen got angry and whatever. So that's kind of the topic of the discussion on Daf 66 and 67. It's really like permutations on the theme of entitlement through the status of others. That includes, by the way, Kinyan Kaspo, that an acquisition of money of a Kohen is also able to eat truma, and that includes his slaves, right? Or her slaves, right? That they are also able to consume truma just because they are kind of owned by that. So that was a discussion over there. All right. So moving on. And again, for those of you who are using the chat, that's awesome. I like to follow along the chat while I'm talking. So feel free to go ahead and put questions or comments in the chat. Next issue is actually interesting. We talk about the different properties that a woman brings into a marriage with her. And actually, I mean, the topic of Yevamot, maybe Rachel, I can share with you this information, but we're doing a really interesting discussion at the Shtibel on Zoom at my shul in Philadelphia on Monday with an organization called Rise, which is about ending child marriage and forced marriage in the United States. And we're having a discussion about Masechet Yevamot, actually, and bringing up some of these questions that have been really, really difficult because sometimes we're 73 dapim in now, and we have to be really careful not to desensitize ourselves to these things, right? Like midway through the week, we're like, oh, if a 9-year-old has sex, right? We have to like be really careful to, yes, both learn the Gemara and also not forget to not, remain sensitive to these issues. Exactly, Laura. Exactly. Okay. So when a wife gets married, right, she brings in certain kinds of properties with her to a marriage. This was a really interesting discussion. Nichtse Tzon Barzel. This is called literally iron sheep property. Iron sheep property. Did anyone get married and in their little suitcase they brought into the marriage have a bunch of iron sheep? Right. I just like that image in my mind. No, it's not literally iron sheep. It actually means items that the wife brings into the marriage, where in the event of the husband's death or a divorce, she gets the value of the item at the time of the marriage. Now, why is it called iron sheep property? You can try to put it in the chat and answer that question yourselves if you want. Iron sheep property, iron sheep. Well, because if you bring in a sheep to the marriage, the sheep might die, it might get sad, it might get hungry, and it will change in value from the time that it came into the marriage to the time, or it might die even, to the time of the divorce or the death. But it's iron in that its asset value is iron, right? So whatever value it was when it came into the marriage, that's the value she receives on the way out of the marriage. Now, what's very interesting is the Gemara on Daf 66, 67 talks about whether she can demand the item or cash, right? Can she say to the man, I want this item specifically back? Or is he allowed to say, no, you can take the value. You can take the value of that item. So there was a discussion. And underneath that discussion was a really interesting sub-discussion, I think, like a subtext about sentimental value and the things that are really brought into a marriage. The other kind of property that's brought into the marriage is called nichse malog. These are items where, or for example, slaves, where any gain or loss in value during the marriage go to the wife. So that's the difference between these two kinds of properties. Okay, so Daf 68 was a tricky one because it talked about the effect of a 9-year-old having sex. That was a tricky one. But we actually say that even though a 9-year-old is not legally responsible for most things, we say that that's the age at which there's a sexual liability, particularly like if a married woman does have sex with this particular person, then she is considered an adulterer if she is married, right? So that is this particular daf. It was very tricky. And this is more about the pregnant widow and things related to that. All right, Daf 69, moving through the Daf. And again, any questions or comments, feel free to put in the chat. Several interesting things on Daf 69. If you're following along with me or in Sefaria, feel free to scroll on by. One has to do with the status of a fetus in early pregnancy, which is really interesting. One thing, the abortion debate is raging very hot in America right now. And what's so interesting, if you do Daf Yomi, you know that if someone corners you and says, what's the Jewish view on this topic? You would be like, how many hours do you have? Right. That's like, it's not like a soundbite, right? What you can see is that pregnancy, childbirth, these things actually have different effects in different areas of halacha. It really, really ranges. And let's talk about on Daf 69, we got a little hint, and it's not the end, but it's a little bit of a hint. One has to do with the status of a fetus in early pregnancy. According to Rav Chisda, pregnancy in the first 40 days is what's called maya be'alma, simply water in the woman's body. That's this particular opinion of the Gemara. And we also see a little bit on Daf 69 about what we determine as questionable lineage and how we treat that. There's also, later on in the last couple of days, we talked about how uncircumcised can mean actually uncircumcised or just almost like a slur in some ways, right? It's like, oh, you're just a non-Jew, right? That's possibly what it means as well. But I guess what's been super interesting about Yevamos is you have words that seem to have very, very specific meanings, like mamzer, which means there's actually a debate about what it means, right? Rabbi Akiva says it's a child that's born of a union that's prohibited by negative commandment. And the sages say it's a child born of a karet punishable union, a union punishable on a higher level, right? So it's a very specific explanation and meaning. And at the same time, it also kind of gets thrown around in modern terminology to mean things that aren't specific. So that comes up on today's daf as well. You kind of think about, well, what do these words really mean? One of the words that's brought up is a shtuki. Shtuki. On daf 69, we see this word. It's kind of hard to say. I'm going to go ahead and put it in the chat because it's just such an interesting word, shtuki. That's what it is. Now, this is a child of questionable lineage, in that if the prospective husband of a woman fathers a child with a woman before they get married, there's a debate about whether that child is a mamzer or a shtuki. Now, what's a shtuki? Steinsaltz, in his commentary, says something interesting. He says that what it is, that name, what Hebrew word does that sound like? If you put it in the chat, what Hebrew word, if you are a Hebrew speaker or you know some Hebrew, what word does this look like or sound like? Put it in the chat. Shtuki, quiet, right? So from kind of sounds like silence, right? Even though it's like flipped around a little bit, check it as quiet. Shtuki, there's a little bit of a connection there between these words. Shatak, right, which means to silence. So the Gemara explains actually elsewhere that when a shtuki calls their father, the mother silences him. Shh, right? And so that's a shtuki. That's one approach to what this is. Okay. So we also saw something really interesting about if a Kohen gives his wife a divorce and then says in the divorce conditionally, you will be divorced 1 hour before I die. That's what he says in the divorce. He hands her a divorce document and says, you're going to be divorced 1 hour before I die. What happens in that situation? She has to stop eating truma immediately. She has to stop eating truma immediately. Why? Because we say he can die at any moment. And then she will no longer be connected to him, as his spouse at that point. So she would have to stop eating truma. All right, I'm going to pause and take a look at the chat. Oh, Aaron's question is very good. Was eating truma in Talmudic times just a symbolic privilege, or was it the difference between survival and starvation? It was definitely a privilege, right, to be able to eat sanctified foods. And at the same time, it was not the only food that a Kohen would have access to, right? There were other Kohanic gifts that they could take in and sell for other food, but this was a special kind of sanctified food that they would be able to eat. Very good. Keep them coming in the chat. Can you please explain the 1 hour? Yeah, for sure. So let's say Joe and Jane get married. Joe is a Kohen. Jane is not. Now, by marrying Joe, she can actually access his truma, right? Or his, his Kohanic privileges in that way. There's a debate about what activates that, right? Is it a child? In any event, they get married. She's able to access his truma. Now, things aren't going so well for them, and he wants to, they decide to get a divorce. He writes out the divorce, and in the divorce document, he says, I'm going to divorce you 1 hour before I die. And she's like, why don't you just give me a regular divorce, dude? And he's like, no, this is what I'm going to write in here. If it was a regular divorce, everything would be fine. She would have to stop eating truma immediately because they're no longer married. But because of the way he wrote it, actually, they're not quite divorced yet, but also she can't eat truma anymore because he can die at any moment. And then that hour before he's dead, she can't eat truma, right? So that's the weird case in that situation. I'm looking in the chat. Yeah. another mean-spirited divorce. I mean, yeah, I'm kind of joking, but also it's interesting. All right, let's continue on Daf 70. This is where we've been for the last couple of days. We move on to other examples of prohibited marriages that come from other kinds of statements, like someone who's not circumcised for medical reasons. What is their effect when it comes to the Korban Pesach, the Paschal Lamb, the Pesach offering, or marriage? Those kinds of things. So this has been a really interesting question of people who are both included and excluded in the community. Someone who is not circumcised for health reasons, for example, is still 100% Jewish, according to the Daf on Daf 71. Even if you make a neder, let's say someone makes a vow not to benefit from uncircumcised people or their stuff, that person can still benefit from all Jews, circumcised or not. This is actually really important because what we're saying is there are reasons why perhaps someone is unable to be circumcised or unable to do certain rituals, right? It doesn't only have to be circumcision, but that doesn't actually exclude them from the experience of being Jewish. We also learned the halacha that if a parent does not circumcise their child, and we talked about actually the obligation of both the father and the mother in this regard, the child may not eat of the Korban Pesach, but may benefit from truma, but may benefit from that holy food, which is interesting. Even if until he is 13, and then himself responsible for circumcision. All right. Any other questions, comments as we keep going? Typical marital age? No, I don't know. I'm actually interested to speak with this woman from this organization, kind of like thinking about what was or is the typical marital age. There seems to be ages at which betrothal happens and marriage happens after that. At what point is a child considered to be sexually available is like a disturbing and possible question. Dr. Steinman, you want to pop in?
Am I mistaken? Aren't there texts that say, at such and such we do this age and such, and at 20 is the marriage canopy?
That is one approach.
Do we have that which suggests that was typical at the time?
Yeah, so we see Shmona Esrei l'chuppah, right?
It was 18. Okay.
18 is the the time for marriage, but we think maybe that's about boys, right? And then the question is, we're seeing all of these cases about girls that are much younger. So how much is this an abstraction and how much is the reality? I'm not sure. Yeah. Any of them MJLs addressed this yet? Do you know? I'm not caught up the dailies.
I don't know exactly if we know.
Yeah.
I don't know if we know. And certainly, yes, they are talking about 3-year-old girls and 9-year-old boys, but these are clearly boundary cases. I wouldn't say that that's, right. I think it's very clear that that's not typical at all. Thankfully.
Yeah. I don't know. It's so interesting. So sometimes in Yevamos, I'm like, okay, that must not be typical at all. What an absurdity. And then sometimes I'm like, oh, then what happens? How do you know when it's not an absurdity? Sometimes in the Gemara, they say, once there was an incident where, right? So sometimes that shows up in the Talmud and you're like, oh, shoot, I thought that was actually an absurd case. And then suddenly it's real. And then you have to start to wrap your head around it in a different way. Okay, let's check the chat. Our male converts. Yeah. So Stephen, it depends, of course, on the denomination of Judaism, the type of Judaism you're talking about. But in many circles, that is a requirement, or the requirement if they have been circumcised, what's called hatafat dam brit, the removal of a ceremonial drop of blood, right? If the circumcision already happened. Now let's go there. That's really where we are right now. It was very circumcision-y the last 3 days. We talked about all kinds of technical and medical kind of issues, including, by the way, when a circumcision is delayed. And I'm sure there are people in this room who have stories, both of their own children or themselves, where that brit had to be delayed for some reason. Different things that we might not have known before this stuff is an issue with the eyes, right? Can actually create, that was considered sick enough that the uncircumcised infant would have to wait. And we also saw that there was a requirement of 7 full days for healing. Another interesting medical comment of the Talmud this week was that a fever supports the immune system of the child, almost as if they're eating, which is very interesting. I'm curious to understand kind of scientifically what they were thinking in that regard. Strange case as well, very strange case. We have another, I said before, there's a lot of complexity around pregnancy and childbirth in halacha. One idea is that the baby is born or considered to be born when the head actually emerges from the body, from the woman's body. Now, we saw a strange case a few days ago. What if the head is out and the body is in for like a week, right? And we talked about that particular case. And, the Gemara thought this was ridiculous. We talked a little bit about that, but that was a kind of in between case. Also, you might have seen, if you're curious or interested, that the name for the vaginal canal is actually called the prosdor, which means the hallway. And I don't know, I like to mention this because what's so interesting about when the Gemara talks about female anatomy, they use architectural terms for the most part, right? So it's prosdor, the hallway, the aliyah, which is the bladder, which is also means that the attic, which is interesting. You have the cheder, the inner room, the uterus, the petach, right? The opening or the door. It's just a very interesting way to think about what's really going on in the rabbinic imagination around birth and childbirth.
And she's a bite.
She's a bayit, right? Of course. And Laura popped in also as well to say that, right? I think so. Yeah, it's really interesting and helps us understand perhaps how the Gemara and the sages relate to the experience of pregnancy and childbirth. Okay, let's go. Daf 72. We're doing so well here. Great job. Please keep putting things in the chat, things that were interesting, questions. More complexities on 72 about who can eat truma, including those who try to hide their circumcision, which is really interesting. So right now, actually in this morning's Daf Yomi and my shiur, someone asked, how did we get here exactly? How did we arrive here? So we've kind of ventured from discussion of wife yavama into marriages that are permitted or forbidden. And included in that are questions of uncircumcised folks and Kohanim. And that's where we are right now. Now, there was actually a certain period of time, which the Gemara discusses, where there was pressure for men to undo their circumcisions during the period of Greek rule. And that was called the mashuch. It was like pulled, right? And then they were going to redo them during the Bar Kokhba rebellion. And we see here in the Gemara on yesterday's daf that they were circumcised a second time during the days of Ben Koziva. That's Bar Kokhba, another way to refer to Bar Kokhba. Now, this is interesting historically, of course, but think about what this really means about Jewish identity and the connection to pain and embodied pain. I think about what is happening here, right? There's circumcision has already happened. There's a procedure as an oppressive move or persecution. And then again, right, to re-enter the Jewish people. So there's a lot of interesting stuff there to think about. So there's the debate also on Daf 72 about whether a brit milah, should take place during the day, even when it's not being done on the 8th day itself, for a delay, as it were. So this is really interesting because, I don't know, you probably have not been to a bris at night. The Torah says it should be on the 8th day. So many communities will have a bris during the day and not at night. But there's a debate in the Talmud of this week of, can I actually do it during the nighttime if it's not on time? Right? Being on time is very, very connected to the brit. So what if it's not on time? Maybe I can do it at night. All right. Finally, give me a moment. Let me look at the chat. Oh, interesting. I bet we have doctors in the room also. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Laura, interesting comment about maybe the light wouldn't be good enough, right, at night for such a delicate operation. That's really, really interesting. The discussion is open to anyone, but I don't know, maybe Dr. Schneiderman, we could touch base about, putting the link in the chat or something in a minute. I don't know.
Sure. If you feel comfortable sharing, I'm sure folks would love to come.
Great. I will go ahead and do that. So let's just get to the final part of the daf today, of the week, daf 73. This should have sounded a little bit familiar to you. This is a repeat of something we saw in Masachet Yoma about who can help with the red heifer, the para aduma. We talked about who is included in this: women, minors, people who are impure. There was a whole range of who can actually be involved in this. So that was today's discussion. And we looked at a bunch of different connections also between the different kinds of holy foods that have to be consumed either by the Kohanim or in Yerushalayim, including the Truma, which we talked about a moment ago, the Bikurim, the first fruits, and the Maser Sheni, the second tithe. So these were all things that came up on today's daf as well. Any other questions? What a week. Thoughts? Otherwise, I'll stop. But
it is a feat to get through that much material in 30 minutes.
Yeah, it was. I kind of went fast.
A definite feat.
Yeah, yeah. Mark has a question. You want to pop in, Mark? Or was that a mistake?
I don't see a hand.
All right. It went up and down. All good. So if you just go to this website, you will be able to see the information for Monday's event. It will be posted probably later today, but it's 7 p.m. Eastern time on Monday. If you want to hear me in conversation with Frady Reese from the organization about Unchained, about child marriage and forced marriage, along with Masachet Yevamot. So I'll give you some more information on that. All right, everybody, have a wonderful day.
Okay, thank you so much, Rabbanit Fruchter. Thank you to all of you for joining us and staying strong through this tractate and this whole 7-year process. It's really inspiring to see all of you here, and we're lucky to have so many talented teachers, including Rabbanit Fruchter. Please do feel free to check out her class and other amazing Daf Yomi things she's doing at the South Philadelphia Shtibel, and we will see you all soon. Thanks, everybody. Bye.